Today is Sunday, January 2nd, 2011. I'm speaking with Sonia Pressman Fuentes at her home in Sarasota, Florida. Sonia, let's start with the question of language. What languages did your parents speak? What languages did you grow up with?
Well, I think my parents spoke Yiddish. It's hard for me to know what they did speak because it's so long ago. But because I can understand Yiddish so well, I'm thinking that they spoke Yiddish. I'm trying to remember whether they also spoke German. I doubt it, but they lived in Germany for 20 years. Maybe they did. I know a little German, so I'm thinking that maybe I picked that up from my brother and from maids that we used to have. Not really sure.
Was your family did they keep kosher or keep Shabbos?
My mother thought she was religious, but I don't really think she was. She did keep a kosher home. They did not keep Shabbos. They went to the synagogue infrequently, some Friday nights for the high holidays, high holy days, I meant to say. I don't feel they were religious, but the home was very much a Jewish home.
Looking back at your family, did you have a role model for your feminism? That is, did you get a role model from your mother or how your father treated your mother? Or did you choose that as a point of opposition?
I certainly didn't get a role model for my being a feminist activist from my parents or from my home. I also wasn't doing it in opposition to anything or to spite anything. I did know that I wanted to lead a different kind of life from that which my parents led. But my role models came much later and not from my family.
Do you think or feel that the Jewish tradition inspired your work with the feminist movement?
I think being Jewish is a very important part of who I am and is an important part of everything I've done and everything I do. I can't say that it inspired me to become a feminist activist, but first of all, my being Jewish led to my having to escape from Germany with my family and led to my understanding that I had to leave because I was a member of a minority group, and therefore led to my interest in fighting discrimination against minorities and women who, while not a minority group in this country, have traditionally been treated like a minority group.
So do you think religious observance played any part in that?
No, not at all.
How did your feelings of self-worth, strength, and power change from your initial childhood in Germany through the flight away and then the resettling in the U.S.? In particular, how did each of those shifts transform you into the activist you were to become?
That was really a lifelong development. When I think of myself as a child and a teenager, I think of someone who had no self-confidence, was unsophisticated, had no social savoir-faire, didn't really know how to dress or relate to people. My one saving grace in those days was that I was a good student. I was always a good student, and I was always at the top of my class and the top of my school, but that was my only saving grace in my youth. And of course, why should I have self-confidence? I had no record of success at that time to look back on. So I think my becoming the person I am today, and the person I have become, had to do with everything I've done in my life since then.
In your book, Eat First, You Don't Know What They'll Give You, you demonstrate some levity about some pretty important stuff. How has this sense of humor helped or hindered your ability to communicate with people?
I have always had a sense of humor. I value people who have a sense of humor. It is a way of looking at life and looking at the world without taking it too seriously. My brother, who was as different, well, I was going to say he was as different from me as could be, but that's not true because we shared some traits in common and many other traits we did not share in common. Our basic outlook on life was totally different, but he always had a sense of humor. As to whether that helps me communicate with people, I don't know. I think sometimes it helps people to feel more comfortable with you, or to feel that you're a human being, if they notice that you have a sense of humor. Sometimes it may hurt you with people who don't share your sense of humor. It can probably cut both ways. Neither my mother nor father had a sense of humor. So why my brother and I had one, I don't know, except for the following. When I was a teenager, I learned that my mother's father, who was called a batchen, which is like a joke teller, an entertainer. Another word for him was marshalik. I think these are words in Polish and in Yiddish. He made his very meager living by going to weddings and bar mitzvahs and telling jokes and stories. So I was delighted when I heard that, because I realized that whatever ability I have as a performer comes from my maternal grandfather.
When you arrived in New York, if you remember, what was the emotional state of your immediate family? Whom did you live with, and were there any support structures in place for you?
There were no support structures, except my father always said that an organization called HIAS, H-I-A-S, which stands for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, helped us find an apartment. And we lived in the Bronx when we first came to the United States. We had no support structure. We had some cousins living in Brooklyn, and my father thought perhaps he would go into business with one of those cousins, and shortly before we arrived here, that cousin died. So we were basically on our own, but we had some money. My father had shipped his money from Germany abroad before we left Germany. So we had money, and I don't remember anything about our emotional state. It's too long ago. But as far as I know, my father immediately set about making a living. We had an apartment, and he went into business in Manhattan with a partner.
You were how old at that point?
I was a month short of 6 years old when we arrived.
Could you take us briefly through the route that you followed to get to this country from where you started?
Well, we left Germany.
What year?
I should really go back and say that Hitler was appointed Vice Chancellor of Germany on June 30th, 1933. And my brother started keeping a diary in 1932 in German shorthand. And he immediately noticed, and it's revealed in his diary, the threat that Hitler and the Nazis were to the Jews. And I have never gotten over his can't say the word perspicacity in realizing that Jews would be exterminated by the Nazis so early on. And so he was after my father for the family to move. But my father wouldn't hear of it. He had lived in Germany with my mother for 20 years, over 20 years, and he had lived there several years before he met my mother. He ran away from Poland to Germany when he was 14. And he was the owner of or manager, he ran which belonged to him. He ran a men's clothing store with a small factory in the back. He had just bought an investment property consisting of 44 apartments, and the idea of leaving Berlin, you wouldn't even consider. The natural feeling was these thugs will blow over and everything will be all right. So my brother, meanwhile, saw a number of incidents happening to Jews, one of which was some of Hitler's thugs, some of whom had worked in our store, came into the store to rob the store. And my brother called the police, and the police came and chased out those guys. But they said to my father, if something like this happens again, don't call us because you are Juden, and we won't come again. So that was, one of the precipitating factors for my brother. And when he saw that my parents wouldn't leave, he decided to leave by himself. He was about 19 at the time. He initially wanted to leave for London, but couldn't get a visa for London. And we had a cousin in Antwerp, Belgium, called David Mendelsohn. And my brother left for Antwerp. I only found out recently that my brother left on a tourist visa and really didn't have a legal visa to stay in Antwerp more than whatever that visa was for. And then my parents, after my brother was in Antwerp a short time, began to ask him to come back. And they told him that they heard that they saw that things were doing better in Berlin and he should come back. And my brother said he was afraid to come back because he read in the paper that Jews who had left, when they returned, the Nazis were at the train station waiting for them and they were never seen again. But my brother said if my parents order him to come back, he will come back. He was a dutiful son. So my parents ordered him to come back, and he was going to come back. And meanwhile, and I don't know what caused this change of sentiment, my father sat down with a group of Nazis in a small room, and he agreed to give them our men's clothing business and the apartment house he had bought for a fraction of their value, and they agreed to let us go. So in something like July of 1933, my parents and I joined my brother in Antwerp. And some of this I've just recently discovered from the staff of the Red Star Line Museum in Antwerp. This is a museum that's going to be built in the spring of, going to be opened in the spring of 2012, dedicated to the Red Star Line shipping line. And they're going to have a temporary and a permanent exhibit about my family and me. And one of their representatives was here recently, and she gave me all kinds of documents and pictures, and she's done an incredible research job finding out what happened to my family in Antwerp, which I did not know. I always knew that my father and brother, mostly my father, went all over Europe trying to find a way to make a living after we arrived in Antwerp. Something for him to do and something for my brother to do, and nothing worked out. That part I knew. What I didn't know was that my brother was frantically going around trying to get legal visas to remain in Antwerp. He only had, as I mentioned, a tourist visa. Mandy, the consultant to the Red Star Line Museum who was here, told me that my parents only had a one-day visa. And they were totally illegal in Antwerp. So my brother was running around, filling out applications all over the place, getting a lawyer to try to help us. The mayor of Antwerp tried to help us, trying to get legal visas for my parents and my brother. And everything was denied. Meanwhile, my father was reading the Yiddish paper, and he read that ships were leaving for the United States. So he turned to my mother and said, "Look, ships are leaving for the United States, let's go." So in April of 1933, the four of us boarded the SS Westernland, which was one of the ships of the Red Star Line, and left for the United States. I learned recently from Mandy that after we left, the police came to our apartment building to serve us with a deportation notice, but we had already gone. And I read some of the papers that my brother had, and it really blew my mind. When they denied our request for legal visas, they had several reasons. One was that they didn't need somebody else from a foreign country in the men's clothing business, because they had plenty of Belgians in the men's clothing business. And then they said we could go back to Poland. There was no reason we couldn't go to Poland to live. Well, of course, my parents hadn't lived in Poland for over 20 years. That was ridiculous.
So you were born in Germany then?
I was born in Berlin.
Okay.
But the other thing that I've thought about when I've gotten this new information recently was how ironic it was. Had my brother succeeded and gotten the visas that we wanted so that we could have remained in Belgium, we would have been killed there. Because we were denied, we came to the United States and all had lives.
And you grew up and became a lawyer.
Yes.
Why law? What inspired you? What goals and motivations did you have? Money, social good, empowerment?
Well, when I was growing up, I never knew what I wanted to do. And I didn't even plan on going to college. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college.
Do you think you had a sense of the trauma your family had been through at that point?
Oh, I knew about that. You're asking wonderful questions, Joan.
These are just things I want to know.
Terrific. I knew from the age of 10 that there was something I was supposed to do. And there were 3 reasons for that. One was that I knew I was bright. The second reason was that my mother had had 7 abortions before I was born, because it wasn't fashionable for well-to-do people in Berlin to have a lot of children. And when she became pregnant with me, she went again to her abortionist, who happened to be out of the country. He was having an affair with a ballerina and was out of the country with her. So my mother came home. She had 2 abortionists, and she assumed she would go to the second one the next day or whatever. And my father came home, and she told him what had happened, and he said, "Let it be already."
Thank goodness for ballerinas.
So that was the second reason that my life had been saved. And the third one was, when my mother didn't have an abortion, and the third one was that it was again saved from the Holocaust. So I was 10 years old, and I knew that there was something I was meant to do in the world. But I never mentioned that to anybody because they would have thought I was crazy. So I had this knowledge. I also knew that I wasn't free to just meet somebody, date, and get married. Because of this knowledge that there was something I was meant to do, I knew that that path was not for me. But what I was supposed to do, I didn't have the slightest idea. As I said, I did not have any intention of going to college. I planned to be a secretary, which is what women did in those days. And when I started high school, you were given a choice. You could either take a course called Introduction to Business, or you could take the college entrance. So I signed up for the Introduction to Business. And I was in that course for a short time, and the teacher came to me, and she said, "You don't belong in this course. You need to go into the college entrance course." So I said, "All right," but I still had no intention of going to college. And then one day I was in the ladies' room, and a classmate of mine came in, and she said, "Are you going to go to college after you graduate?" And I said, "No, I'll be too old." I was a year older than some of my classmates because I started kindergarten when we came to the United States. So I would be 22 when I graduated from high school. I'm sorry, from college. 18 when I graduated from high school. My classmates were mostly 17. So I said, "No, I'll be too old to go to college." She said, "Well, I intend to go to college." So I said to myself, wow, she has such a self-confidence that she'll go to college. But I still had no plans to go.
Let me ask you, don't want to interrupt, but when you came to this country, did you speak any English?
No.
So they put you in kindergarten
No, I
at
had
that
to.
stage to learn English?
No, I just started kindergarten. I don't know that it had anything to do with learning
Okay.
English. I learned English right away.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I just started kindergarten. I'd already gone to kindergarten in Antwerp. So I probably was a very good kindergarten student because I went twice. So I was in the college entrance course, but I didn't plan on going to college. And then a classmate of mine, Jake Nemerson, said to me that he was going to the next community, Middletown. And that's not just next. It was about 30 miles away. He was going there to take a test for a college scholarship.
Now, is this in New York or?
Monticello, New York, where we were living in the Catskills. And he asked me if I wanted to ride with him and take that scholarship. So I said, I don't know. I'll ask my father. So I went to my father and I said to him, Jake is offering me to go with him to Middletown to take a test for a scholarship. Should I be going with him? So my father said, how much is the test? I said, $7. He said, and what do you get if you win the scholarship? I said, $400. He said, why are you asking me? You pay $7 and you get $400. There's no question. He didn't understand that not everybody wins the scholarship. So I went with Jake Nemeson, and I won that scholarship. And that's what got me started thinking about going to college. And you asked me about law school, though.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a long story. So then I graduated from college, and I thought the world would come beating a path to my door.
Your field of concentration is what?
I majored in everything. My first year I was a language major because I loved languages, and especially Latin. And I thought I would be an interpreter at the United Nations.
A lot of Latin speaking people at the United Nations.
No, but my Latin wasn't that kind of Latin.
No.
So then I said, it's not enough just to be a translator. I need to do something else. So I switched from that to psychology. And for about a year, I was a psychology major. And then somebody said to me, you can't do anything in psychology unless you have a master's or a PhD, which I had no plans of getting. To me, a college education was already way off the top. So then I was going to switch from psychology, and I didn't know what to switch to anymore. So Cornell had a program where you could take your senior year of college as the first year of the Graduate School of Business and Public Administration, which was a 2-year course at that time. So I took my senior year in the Graduate School of Business and Public Administration. I came out, as I said, thinking the world would beat a path to my door because, to me, college was such a big thing. Well, I sent out 200 resumes, and I couldn't get a job. Phi Beta Kappa. And all along my mother was saying, study shorthand, go to a business school. Because I already had typing. But I thought, shorthand, here I am, a college graduate, what am I going to take shorthand for? But after 7 months of not getting any kind of jobs, I went to business school.
Do you think some of that was because you were female?
All of it, probably.
Okay.
But maybe some of it was that when I came out of college, what was I actually qualified to do? Now, I did have a short job when I came out. I opted for what they called a fashion training or something like that at McCreary's department store. And I went to work for McCreary's, but to be this fashion trainer, or whatever I was being trained for, you had to first be a sales lady. And I was a sales lady for 3 days. I liked it very much, but I couldn't stand on my feet all day long. So I had to leave that. So then I went to the Brown Business School in Hempstead, New York, to study shorthand. And I had a very good skill after 2.5 months. I used to come home, and I'd go to school in the morning, and in the afternoon, my mother would sit and dictate to me, and I'd take it in shorthand. So I broke records at the school by achieving a certain speed after 2.5 months, and I left. And I graduated not graduated, but I finished on a Friday, and a Monday I had a job as a secretary. So for the next 4 years, I was working as a secretary. I had different jobs, but I would always quit for the winter. My parents were going to Miami Beach for the winter. So I would quit for the winter, go to Miami Beach with my parents, come back, and on one of my jobs, when I was working for Fawcett Publications, my boss always took me back at the end of the winter when I returned. So I was doing this for about 4 years, and felt that I was getting no place fast. And when people asked me what I did, and I said secretary, to them that was perfectly acceptable because that's what women did. But every time I said secretary, I didn't feel right about it because I felt I had gone to college. I should be doing something else. So I started to think about it, and I began to think about going to law school. Because one year when we were in Miami Beach, I was driving past the University of Miami, and it looked so lovely. I said to myself, oh, I would like to go there. And then I said to myself, you already went to college, you can't go again. So then I said, but if I went to law school, I could go again. So that was one influence on me. Another one was that in the Catskill Mountains, my parents had a husband and wife legal team, Joe and Ethel Cooperman. So I had a role model of a woman lawyer. And then we had read in a great books course that I took, Thomas Aquinas on law. And I loved that. And then I had a wonderful teacher who was a guest teacher when I was at the Graduate School of Business and Public Administration. One of my teachers was David Curtis, who was a teacher at the Cornell Law School. And he came over and taught in the business school a course on bills and notes. Now that sounds like a dull subject, but David Curtis was such a wonderful teacher that he made that subject interesting, and it got me interested in law. As a sideline, David Curtis and his wife called me a few weeks ago. He is now in his 90s, and he's in an assisted living place in Ithaca, New York. And I know the dean of the law school, Stuart Schwab, because I've given a talk there. And when I spoke to Stuart one time, I told him what an influence David had had on my life. And Stuart told me that David is alive and in this home for assisted living, and that he and his wife go regularly to visit David. So I said, next time you go, would you give him my regards and tell him what a role he played in my life? And so as a result of that, David Curtis and his wife called me to say how meaningful it was to them that I thought of them and remembered them and all that. So does that bring you up to law school yet?
It
Just
does.
about. Huh?
And so there you were, and you finished law school and went into practice?
Well, not exactly.
You were, after all, a woman.
Huh?
You were, after all, a woman.
Well, no, it
And we know what
didn't,
kind of
didn't
job
occur to me.
Sandra Day O'Connor was able to get after.
Well, that
law
didn't
school.
occur to me. When I went to law school, it was always my intention to go into private practice, like Joe and Ethel were in private practice. So, except that during the summers, while I was going to law school, one summer I clerked for a law firm in Miami Beach. And that was a disillusioning experience. On the other hand, the next summer I was a secretary for Joe and Ethel in Ellenville, New York. And that was a wonderful experience. So I was in my senior year of law school, and I got a phone call one day from one of the professors who had never been one of my professors. Her name was Minette Massey. And she called me up and she said, Sonia, did you see that on the bulletin board there's a notice that recruiters are coming from the federal government to interview students for jobs in Washington, D.C.? And I said, yes, Minette, I noticed that, but I have no interest in going to work for the federal government or living in Washington, D.C. So she said, well, I made an appointment for you Friday at 2. I think you should go. So I had no interest in it, but she had made the appointment. What could I do? So I went to that interview, and I was offered a job, and that's what brought me to Washington, D.C. to work for the federal government.
As a lawyer, would you say you had what you would call a finest moment, or a few of those that you could tell us about?
Well, I guess the most significant thing I did was that in October of 1965, I joined the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That agency was only in operation 3 months when I joined it. It was an almost a brand new agency whose mandate was to decide complaints of employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Later on, age and physical or mental disabilities were added. And I was the first woman attorney in the Office of the General Counsel of that agency, and I played a significant role in interpreting the prohibitions against sex discrimination in employment.
And then as a lawyer, what would you say was your hardest time? A case, well, I take you didn't have cases as much as you had these interpretations.
Right.
Or what would you say was an impossible or really uncomfortable situation?
Well, that's hard to say. I think once early on in my career, I was asked to sign something that I didn't agree with, and I refused to sign it, and I had no complications from that. I think the first year and a half at the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, were difficult because I read the law and saw that it prohibited sex discrimination along with the other forms of discrimination. But for the first year and a half, the 5 commissioners weren't really doing anything about the prohibition against sex discrimination. And that was for 2 reasons, basically. One, most of the people had come there because of the civil rights movement to do something about race discrimination in this country. That's why the act was passed. And so they didn't want the commission's time and money diverted to cases of sex discrimination. The second reason was that the issues of sex discrimination presented difficult legal issues for interpretation, which nobody knew how to resolve.
Did you yourself experience any sex discrimination at that job?
Somebody asked me recently, a friend of mine asked me recently whether I'd experienced sex discrimination in my lifetime, and I said no. And then she had read my memoir, and she said, what about this, what about this, what about that? And I totally forgotten about it. But those were all cases where I was trying to find a legal job in Washington, and I couldn't get one because I was a woman, and in Chicago, too. Other than that, I can't think of any instances of sex discrimination. Perhaps some difficulty in getting my last promotion, but I'm not even sure of that. I think the only sex discrimination I found was when I was looking for other employment outside of the federal government.
Did you see sex discrimination around you, anything that made you feel really discouraged?
This is not really sex discrimination. Maybe it is. One time, there was a party, and when I came into the party, the man who was my boss's boss came over to me, took my hand, and said, "You're going to be my date for tonight." Now, he was a married man, and I was totally confused. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't going to be that man's date. I also could not offend him because it would mean my job, and I knew that. So I was standing there trying to think how I was going to deal with this when he got an emergency call. There was a strike somewhere, and he had to leave the party. So I didn't have to deal with that. Interestingly, subsequently, I was talking to a woman colleague of mine in that same section, beautiful young woman, and she said he had come on to her too. So I guess that's sexual harassment.
That's the workplace. In your book, you use very down-to-earth, informal, and accessible and approachable language, and a lot of people will be surprised at such down-to-earth language coming from a lawyer and even from an activist. Did you work to make that happen, or is that just who Sonia is?
I worked very hard to make that happen. When I first wrote the book, I wrote it like a lawyer. and I had 108 footnotes. And I remember I devoted a great deal of time when I described the wedding to my husband. I had a whole big footnote about the Jewish tradition of the man's breaking of glass underfoot and where that came from and what that symbolized and all of this. And then I had to go back and rewrite and take out most of those footnotes.
Was that painful?
It wasn't painful. It was a job.
It was hard work.
It was hard work, but it wasn't painful.
I'd really like to hear about how NOW was founded, and could you take us through that time?
It's a long story, but I'll be happy to do that. I was working at the EEOC. This would have been sometime toward the end of 65 or the beginning of 66. And as I mentioned, I was very frustrated because the EEOC was not dealing with problems of sex discrimination. And one day a woman came into the office, a very famous woman writer named Deborah Perkola. She had published her book, the Feminine Mystique, in 1963, and this was 65, 66. She thought she was going to write a sequel to that book about all the progress women had made since she wrote The Feminine Mystique. So she came in to interview my boss, the General Counsel, Charlie Duncan, and his deputy, Dick Berg. But she saw me standing there, a woman, so she came to me, and she said, "What's going on around here? What are the conflicts? What are the problems?" And I said to myself, if I tell this woman what's going on here, she's a writer, I'm going to lose my job. So I said to her, everything's fine here. So 2 weeks later, she came back again. And when she came back again, it was on a day that I'd had it up to here in frustration. So I took her into the privacy of my office, and I told her what was going on at the EEOC, and I said to her that what this country needs is an organization to fight for women like the NAACP fights for, in those days I probably would have said colored people or Negroes. Today I'd say blacks or African Americans. So that was, as I said, in the latter part of 65, early part of 66. And then in June of 66, there was a meeting of the Commissions on the Status of Women in Washington, D.C. And the group wanted to pass a couple of resolutions. One of them was for the EEOC to do its job, and the other one was supporting the reappointment of Dick Graham, who was a feminist, who these women thought might not be reappointed. And they were told that they did not have the authority to pass resolutions. Now, actually, that was for a neutral reason. That meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women was under the aegis of the U.S. Labor Department and the Women's Bureau. And one federal agency can't tell another federal agency what to do. But these women saw it as a slap at them that they couldn't pass resolutions. So they got upset, and they met that night in Betty Friedan's room, hotel room, and the next day at lunch, and they formed NOW. And that was in June of 66. In October of 66, Halloween weekend, there was a second meeting at which I was present. There were 28 people at that first meeting, 28 women at that first meeting who signed up to found NOW. At the second meeting in October, there were another 21 men and women who signed up, to a total of 49 founders.
And that was the beginning of this national organization for women.
That was the beginning of NOW.
Your career path is pretty atypical, I would think, from the world your parents had known in Poland and Germany. Was there any friction with them because of that, or were they pretty accepting and supportive?
Well, some of all of those things.
And
My parents did not want me to go to college because what they knew was that when a young woman turned 18 or so, 20, she should get married and be a housewife and learn how to cook and sew. or cook and so, raise a family. My inclinations were not in that direction. So that's what my parents wanted me to do. Going to college is not what they wanted me to do. But my parents were unbelievably devoted to me. And if that's what I wanted to do, they did everything to help me. So they drove me up to Ithaca from Monticello and paid for my college education. They did even more 4 years later when I said I wanted to go to law school. They wanted me to go to law school even less than they wanted me to go to college. But if that's what I wanted to do, I went. I went on my own. I left the house and went on my own and took a train. My parents were opposed to it. My brother was more opposed to it. And after I got there, I wrote my family that I was having a little difficulty getting around the campus and shopping for groceries because I didn't have a car. As soon as my father heard that letter, he took the train down to Miami Beach, bought me a car, went back up north and said to my mother, we have to sell this house and move to Florida so she has a place to live, because I didn't have a good situation in the dorm that the college set me up in. And so they sold the house to my brother, who was a real estate agent, came down, bought a house in North Miami Beach so that I would have a place to live while I went to law school, for which they paid, which they did not want me to attend.
I would say the answer is very supportive. Very loving parents, I would assume that meant.
Yes.
And you did eventually marry and have a child.
Yes.
And you're single now.
Right.
That marriage ended in divorce.
Right.
Okay. Based on, and your child's an adult, based on your work with the EEOC, I'm imagining that supporting social change for those in need is a pressing issue for you. In your opinion, what are the major issues now facing us? Any long-term predictions or hopes?
I'm not one for predictions. I don't see into the future any more than anyone else can. I hope that the movement for women's equality will continue, both in this country and overseas, and the movement for better living conditions for all peoples all over the world will continue.
As a Holocaust survivor, what are your feelings on Zionism and Israel? Do you have feelings about Zionism, and do you have opinions on what you think Israel should be or could be?
I have very few opinions on Israel and Zionism because I've never felt sufficiently knowledgeable about Israel's history to have strong opinions or its geography. I have always been grateful that my father brought us to the United States rather than to Israel, because I think my life here was a lot easier than it would have been there. I have visited Israel twice. I have cousins there. I am really pretty much an American. I support Israel as a country. I hope someday its neighbors will accept it as a country, but more than that, I don't have any strong opinions.
With the Jewish population across the globe, within that population, does the rise in the population of the Orthodox concern you in regards to the treatment of women?
I really never thought of the Orthodox very much in connection with their treatment of women, although once having said that, I remember that I have given speeches on sex discrimination in Judaism. I talk about the song Tradition, which is full of sexist language. I am a secular Jew. I do not have much in common with the Orthodox. I don't care for fundamentalism in any religion. But I haven't gone around worrying about it. They are, unfortunately, the only people speaking Yiddish these days. And so I guess we have to be grateful to them for that.
Do you continue to give speeches and write articles? And if so, what are some of your current interests to write or speak about, and for what audiences?
Well, I'm looking forward very much to going to Northport High School on the 2nd of February. I will be speaking to 3 classes there, and the whole school has been invited to join those classes if there is room to hear me speak.
This is the Sarasota County School District?
This is a Sarasota County school. Northport happens to be the 4th fastest growing city in Florida and the 4th largest landmass of cities in Florida. None of us know that much about it. I can see from your face, but and I haven't been there many times. But this came up because a non-Jewish teacher from Northport, Carol Lavallee, came to speak at the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, to which I belong. She teaches Holocaust education in Northport. And I heard her speak and was very interested in that and began to communicate with her by email. And then my publisher, Ex Libris, donated 30 copies of my memoir to that school's library. And the different communications resulted in their inviting me to speak. I've also written a couple of articles recently. Both of them, my most recent articles, were published in an e-zine called On the Issues. They have a section called Cafe Section. And one of my articles was on the women judges on the U.S. Supreme Court and other courts, state and federal. And the other article was on all the legal progress women have made since 1964.
What's your involvement with museums, libraries, and Holocaust groups? Where have you had an impact, and what are your current plans?
Well, for the last year, I've been all of a sudden involved with museums. It makes me think I'm getting to be a museum piece. It started some years ago with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned earlier, my brother started keeping a diary in German shorthand in 1932 when we were in Berlin, and he kept it through sometime in 1935. And he had totally forgotten about it, but some years ago he accidentally found it in a night table, and he was just going to keep it for his children, and it took me about 10 years of importuning him, and he donated it to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, along with an English translation that he did with the help of his granddaughter. And I donated a copy of my memoir to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Then they were interested in some of my pictures. I have about 24 albums of pictures and clippings, and they were interested in my pictures of Poland, of my family in Poland and Germany. So I gave them a number of pictures which they have digitalized, and some of them are online. Then the National Museum of Jewish American History in Philadelphia asked me for a copy of a photograph taken in October 1966 of some of the founders of NOW. And I donated that to them, and it's one of their exhibits in Philadelphia. Then I got in touch with this Red Star Line museum that I mentioned earlier, which is going to open in Antwerp in the spring of 2012. And they are going to have both a temporary and a permanent exhibit on me and my family in their museum. They've invited me to come to the opening as their honored guest in the spring of 2012. They've also asked me to come in 2011. And it's possible that the government of Germany will invite me to come to Germany this coming year. And if that comes to pass, I'll then visit Antwerp after I visit Germany. And
Yeah.
finally, there's a Jewish Museum of Florida in Miami. And starting on September 13th this year through next March of 2012, they're going to have an exhibit about me and my family as part of an exhibit they're having on Floridians with Polish connections.
My question was about your relationship with Germany, your feelings towards it, anger, reconciliation with the new generation, a mix. Any negative feelings, I guess, is the question.
Very much mixed. So far have returned to Germany once since we left in 1933, and that was, I went back in November of 1978. I went back as a speaker on women's rights for the United States Information Agency. And when USIA asked me to go, it took me a few weeks to decide whether I wanted to go, because we all know people who say, oh, I wouldn't go there. And I certainly had those feelings, but I spoke to Jewish leaders and rabbis, and they all told me to go. So I went to Germany, and my visit there is the subject of the last chapter of my memoir, and it was a very interesting experience, of course, both positive and negative feelings. And I knew that Germany had this program where they invited Holocaust survivors back for a week. And that program has been going on, 20 or 40 years. And I never was interested in going. But within the past year, I wanted to return to Berlin and Germany. I'd like to see Berlin since the wall came down. And so I was looking into whether I could go. And I found out that that program of inviting Holocaust survivors back for a week ended this year, because just about all the Holocaust survivors who wanted to go went. So I happened to mention this to Marcia Jo Zarevitz, who's the executive director of the Jewish Museum of Florida, and she suggested I try the German consulate in Miami Beach. So I sent them an email or made a phone call. I think I sent an email saying that I was interested in returning to Germany, and a gentleman called me from there and said he thought it would be possible. He's working through the Foreign Office. The last I spoke to him, he called me before Christmas and said it looked like a go to him, that I wouldn't just go alone, that there'd be a group going from the whole United States, but that it had to await their budget, and that he would call me again the end of January, and if the budget allowed it, I would be their choice to go from this area.
So they bring you there and give you a tour of the
Right.
new and modern
Right.
Germany as it is.
Exactly.
That would be lovely. Now, while some of our contemporaries won't have anything to do with computers, you have your own website. Can you tell us something why you created it, and of course what is the address of your website?
Well, the address is www.erratic.impact.com, and that's spelled ERRATICIMPACT.com. And the way I happened to create it was unusual. I had a friend in Australia, and one time she told me to contact somebody named Dan Polk, who was a feminist and had a website. So I sent him an email, and I said, my friend in Australia told me to contact you, so I'm contacting you. And he wrote me back and said, I would like to create a website for you. And he created a website for me. This was a good many years ago. He has maintained it ever since. And I constantly have things happening where the website has to be added to and subtracted and this and that. And Dan's been doing that all these years.
And do you continue to post things on it?
All the time.
Like your talks and things, or?
Most of my talks I don't post there, but I post when we have a speaking section there, and I post when I'm going to be giving a talk. But a number of my articles are there, book reviews are there, articles about me are there. There's a lot of stuff there.
If you had 3 wishes for changes to the world as it is right now, what would they be?
Well, first of all, I'd like to have equality for women all over the world and for all other groups and minority groups that have been the victims of discrimination. Second, I would like to see an end to war and violence. And thirdly, I'd like to see an end to hunger and poverty and homelessness.
Good wishes.